Welcome to Our College, Your Voices. I'm your host, Kara Monroe. This week, we have 2 episodes for you. These episodes are the first of our series of conversations with colleagues from around the state about the book So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo. We'll be bringing you the conversations mostly in their entirety, editing only for flow and where participants requested that something not be placed in the public conversation. I want to thank everyone who participated in these conversations. These talks are hard, but we must have them if we're going to dismantle systemic racism in our country and in our college. I invite you to think through these conversations with us. And if you find yourself uncomfortable, I encourage you to sit with the discomfort. Don't walk away from it. If we're going to make change, we all have to get a little uncomfortable. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to our conversation about So You Want to Talk About Race. And we're going to start today in Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is entitled, What is Intersectionality and Why Do I Need It? And I chose to start with a quote from page 76. And obviously our conversation can go anywhere, but that quote is actually a question, which is one of the reasons I chose it. How do our social efforts so often fail to help the most vulnerable in our populations? Our author gives an answer, but I'd like for us to discuss the question in light of what we've read so far and the concepts she discusses in Chapter 5. So we'll start there and then just go wherever you want to go.
Well, I guess I'll say something since nobody else is saying anything.
Thank you, Ben.
I'm worried about the white man jumping out in front. Well, the thing it makes me think about is talk, that sometimes we don't get past talking. And that's something that's heavy on my heart as we have these conversations. I'm very grateful for this space to discuss things, but I really appreciated some of the comments last week that were directed at action. Social justice efforts have a part which includes talking, but we need to keep in mind that we also need to be doing. And so what does the doing involve?
I thought the quote that you pulled out from Chapter 5 was very interesting because I think intersectionality is not something that we think about very often. I think you do think about the majority groups. And so when you see shirts or signs that might say things like Black trans lives matter or, say her name when it comes to some of the Black women that have been killed, it's interesting because when you stop and really think about it, there is a focus on, men, with Black Lives Matter and, some of the other social movements, they usually focus on whatever dominant group, they're talking about. And she's so right that I think a predominant ideology is let's focus on the perceived majority, within this minority, and then we'll get to the rest later. And she's right that you have to focus on everyone, but it makes it a lot more complicated and sometimes harder, to come up with solutions to problems. But it's important to think about it and keep top of mind.
I thought a lot about this chapter after I read it. And I thought about how we approach things at Ivy Tech and probably at every organization everywhere. And I wonder to answer the question if it is because we're so quantitatively driven, like our numbers measure our success. And so if we're trying to move the needle, then we need to move the majority. And so and I'm curious to hear what everybody else thinks about this, because I thought about this in terms of like our curricular decisions. And I mean, every aspect of the college is numbers driven. And, who are we leaving out then because we're focusing on numbers instead of individual voices?
And if I can piggyback off of Rachel's comment, I've been reading another book called From Equity Talk to Equity Walk. It's a good book. And it highlights kind of this idea that oftentimes with our data, we group it together as one, we say underrepresented groups. And that's a big number, when in fact, that particular text kind of argued for disaggregating the data and looking specifically at Black male populations, Black female populations, or any other person or group as an individual group and looking at those numbers as opposed to lumping everybody of poverty, everybody of color, everybody of whatever. And I think as a result of that, we miss the opportunity. And as our author of this book says, that we tend to spend time with people like us. So if we're part of the majority, as a white male, I'm in the majority. So I'm thinking from the white majority lens, and I'm talking to other people with a white majority lens, and I've never looked at the individual components of, like as our author identifies herself as a Black, single, queer woman, right? That's a very specific type of person. Have we ever looked at that demographic specifically and thought about how do we move that particular group forward and not necessarily just a large majority? I think that can be missed in our large quantitative data numbers.
On page 77, he talks about how intersectionality slows things down. And that really struck me. And I'm that person who thinks if you focus on all these things, all these people, you're never going to get anything done. Mm-hmm. So when she had that quote and said, well, you still need to focus on these other people, I'm like, we're getting nothing done. And for me, I want to see progress. And I don't know that you can have that if you've got to consider everyone, like every single group. How much are you going to get done? So that was what I thought instantly when I read that.
Mm-hmm. And if progress is defined by metrics, the way Rachel had somewhat suggested by that we're so quantitatively driven, it becomes even more frustrating. I was really excited to see that this chapter flows very naturally right out of chapter 4, and how it, it's really I think it's a nice complement to our previous discussions about checking one's privilege, because in order to restore all of the voices, we have to sometimes take a step back and check our own stuff in order to move us forward. The notion of intersectionality as it relates to social justice is directly connected, I think, to restoring voices from the margins, those who are the most vulnerable. I was just having this conversation yesterday with a young woman who is interested in pursuing higher ed, and she's in a doctoral program, and we got into the conversation about the role of qualitative research when we're dealing with issues of diversity. There's an ethical imperative to bringing in the voices of those from the margins. And that's something that a lot of times, with us being so quantitatively focused, that we don't necessarily get to. And so how do we do the work of social justice if we are reductive in our approach and, as far as treating people simply as numbers or metrics? So, that's a lot to process there. I know that's not fully formed or articulated the best, but that's kind of what I took from the initial question.
I want to go back and build on Diane's point. That's the thing I keep thinking about, is how do I make sure that I'm paying attention to the needs of everyone? And Rod, you did such a beautiful job of saying we've got to restore all the voices. And that is, I think what I'm struck by in this chapter is, how do we honor the whole person? And how do we honor everything that the whole person brings to the table?
Well, and I'm struck by Rod's emphasis on bringing in that qualitative aspect. I am not a numbers person. I am an English person. I am a creative person. And so I'm drawn to stories, and I want to hear all of those things. And yet I know that both are important. And so how can we have both quantitative, to look at data, to look at numbers, to, really work to see the needle move on those things, and yet also make sure all the voices are heard, so that we don't end up with either, here's all the data, this is all there is, or here's this multitude of voices and it can be overwhelming. I'm interested in how can we do both, and what's the role of intersectionality in that?
I'm part of a committee on campus where we've been doing some collaborative work with another team, our African American Student Experience team. And the team I'm part of is the student culture and behavior team. And so we were in a meeting one day, and I don't think she's on the call. Jay Watts asked the question, what is the culture of Ivy Tech? And that's a really interesting question, because I think sometimes we sit back in our roles like, well, here's what we want it to be. But we've been working through this, and we're like, culture is really defined by the person who's experiencing it. And so we are thinking of ways that we can ask students what they think the culture of Ivy Tech is, because if we want to try, if they don't think it's going well and we want to try to improve it, we need to know what they want and what they're thinking, so that we can determine what we need to do to make it something that will be better for them. That's very tricky in light of COVID-19. But when Jay asked that question, I think we throw that around a lot. That's just the culture of Ivy Tech. Well, what does that really mean? And unfortunately, a lot of times when we throw it around, it's not used in a positive way. That's just the Ivy Tech culture. I was going to say, Diane, to your point, I think that's a daunting task to try to figure out what that is and try to capture as many voices as possible. And, you're like, how many focus groups do we do before we start moving forward with something? So it can feel very overwhelming to try to capture all of that.
I think the nature of group dynamics also kind of comes into play when I look at this question, and you think about when you acknowledge the splits that are within a group, where they share some factors, but they split otherwise. A group can feel like they no longer have a single group identity, and so I think that does tend to lead them to focus on the one thing they have in common, and sometimes neglect the differences within.
And Sarah, I think it becomes exacerbated. The points that you made, I think it becomes exacerbated by some of the, again, going back to those connections of privilege that lead to pain as a result. To feel that that you are certainly affiliated with one group, and then because of some other aspect of yourself, you then are pushed to the margins because you're not, because of the privilege that that dominates within those groups, even within that group. I think it just becomes very, very hard. The Black Lives Matter movement is extremely important, but then I've recently seen, especially since so much of that language happened to intersect with Pride Month, that you saw these statements about all Black Lives Matter, and there was a very good reason for that, because there's been historically, even within the Black community, a lot of pain directed at those who are a part of the Black community but are also LGBTQ. And so, trying to get all of the voices heard, and recognizing that, that they're all a part, but then also recognizing the distinctions and the differences within that group can be can be challenging. And how then do we move that needle that Rachel talked about, and bend us towards social justice, if we're having then to take the time and slow down to address these issues of intersectionality?
If I may, obviously we're talking a lot about people grouping themselves by, affinity and such, but I think there was an underlying part of this that she kind of gets to in some of her bullet points. Am I listening to people whose identities and experiences differ from mine? Am I looking for what I don't know? I think there's an underlying need that we all have that we have to be very intentional about, and that is we have confirmation bias that goes on. And I think maybe that occasionally can kind of get in our way and put some fog or some static in our work.
To address Diane's question, I do think it's impossible to get anything done if you're trying to have different solutions for so many different groups, subgroups of one group, because that would be impossible to do. But I think what the author is trying to get across is, making sure, as I think someone mentioned, that those voices are at the table when you're talking about solutions, and just being aware that there are subgroups within a certain population. So, she gives a great example of people that are differently abled. I think that's a group that we often don't think about as a subgroup of different groups. So when you're at the table talking about, how are we going to make sure that, a particular group of, racial background feels included, are you making sure that people within that racial group that are differently abled are included in that conversation as well? So I think just being aware that there are these differences and trying to bring as many perspectives to the table to come up with a solution or a series of solutions is maybe what she's trying to get across.
All right, let's expand our conversation to add in. We can always come back into chapter 5 at any point, but let's expand our conversation to add in chapter 6. And chapter 6 is entitled, "Is Police Brutality Really About Race?" And I chose to start with a quote on page 95. I guess for me, this was the key takeaway of the chapter, to remember that it is an entire racist system that we're thinking about as we think about this question. And the quote is, "Just about every police officer that a person of color encounters will be armed, not just with a gun, but with the full force of a justice system that has shown just as much bias against people of color as the police have." So we can start there, or if there are other things you found meaningful in chapter 6 that you'd like to point to, we'll do that.
Hello, this is Gail.
Hi, Gail.
Hi. When I read that, a memory came about. I grew up in a very small farm town, all white, in Northwest Indiana. And when they said about police carrying and I wrote it down too, not only the gun, but the prejudice.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, here we go. This was decades ago, okay, back late 70s, early 80s. If someone of color came into our tiny, tiny, tiny little town, the police would follow them, pull them over, and ask, "Why are you here? What is your business? What is your purpose?" If there's not a problem, the person of color driving will drive out of town, and the police will follow that person out of town to make sure they are out of town. I know this is kind of a controversial or unusual statement to make, but that just really hit me because I observed it and it was talked about. So I'm sorry, maybe I've been off topic or
No.
kind of an unusual statement, but when I read this, that what came to me, I'm like, yes, where I grew up, that was not unusual for that to occur. And reading this is like, this is Northwest Indiana. It's a diverse population. And when we moved here to that town, we're all kind of surprised. My family and I were. So anyway, I just kind of want to say something like that I grew up in a town that kind of believed in that. You follow them, and where's the justice?
Right.
And that's all. I'm done.
Gail, I think the story you tell goes back to the thing in that chapter that was so powerful to me, which is when she talks about the police system, the justice system was created for white people. And from the very beginnings, its origins were about serving that community, not only to the absence of the Black community, but really to protect the white community against the Black community. And so I think all those assumptions in the example that you just shared fit perfectly with history and with how things started and why. So thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
As I was reading this chapter, I do think that it's about race, obviously, but also I found that it can be about authority as well. So when you have people of color, who are police officers, that you sometimes will get treatment. Other Black people, Black police officers will sometimes treat other Black people in a way that you would not expect because of the authority factor. They have this authority I sometimes think that police work draws a certain personality sometimes. And, that authority that they want you to see that they have sometimes comes across in how they interact with you. So initially I was surprised if I would encounter a Black police officer who was, not that nice and I wasn't doing anything wrong. And I thought, oh my goodness, that's an authority issue as well. So I thought that was kind of interesting. That was what I thought about as I was reading that chapter.
For me, I think the system behind a police officer that pulls you over, I think that injustice system is scarier than the police officer himself or herself. I kind of said that a few times the last time we spoke. When you get pulled over, I just think that if things go left, for lack of a better word right now, if things go left with the police officer, you really, as an African American, don't have much of a recourse. And I think everyone saw the injustice that goes behind African American interactions with police officers with the George Floyd situation, when we saw him murder George Floyd and then casually walk away with his hands in his pockets. Like, he knew that he had the criminal justice system behind him and that nothing would happen. And we saw that. Like, we saw that in his behavior. We saw that in his attitude when he casually walked away. And then we later had the quantitative data to show that, this guy doesn't get in trouble when he misbehaves. I think he had like 17 complaints and maybe one time was reprimanded. So I think that is scarier because it then emboldens other police officers to misbehave and treat us any kind of way they want and get away with it. And now you have regular European American citizens now utilizing the criminal justice system against us because they know that it's biased. And so you see so many people say, I'm calling the cops, you're out here barbecuing, or you're calling the cops, you're watching birds, because they know that the system is against us. And all the police have to do is show up and we could be killed.
I definitely think it's a mindset too, though, because look at the demographics of the people that were with that officer who was knee killing George Floyd. Look at the diversity of those 4 people, and they didn't stop him. And that's what really struck me in addition to him doing it, that Derek guy doing that these other officers who were right there didn't stop him. And to me, that was more telling because they weren't all white. So I think the authority mindset, something else goes into play there because any one of them could have stopped him and they chose not to.
I think no matter what the background or the makeup of those particular officers are, they're all participating in a system that was founded on controlling people of color and Black people and not the same sort of treatment that the white folks in the majority most of the time view the police as protecting and serving. It's a totally different experience. And even though they may come, maybe pretty diverse racially on the whole, they're still upholding those same values that the whole system was founded on.
Right.
What to me, on page 84, she talks about, as we've learned, witnesses are the only defense people of color seem to have against police brutality. Well, isn't it pretty shocking in the George Floyd case that all that social media and all those witnesses, the murderer was so nonchalant. He must be so confident in his power and authority. He was casual. And, and he's got people taking pictures of him. I mean, all 4 of them.
I think that all the time, too. Not even necessarily with people, like witnesses taking pictures, but with body cams. Like, you see these things, and I'm like, what is even happening right now? Like, they don't even flinch in behaving these ways. They just feel so confident in what they're doing, and they're filming themselves doing it.
I think the bad part about this is not only are the police officers, just outright misbehaving on camera, but then it goes even further with the data that says, and I know this is kind of, getting deeper, But then you have the whole data that police officers are rarely found guilty when they misbehave. So then they know, well, I might have some bad press for a minute, but I know that I'm not really going to do any time in jail or really be punished for this in the long run. So it just seems like they don't really care because, they don't get in trouble.
Going to the question, the title of the chapter is Police Brutality Really About Race? When I think about the Ahmaud Arbery, and in that situation, it was people trying to take the place of police. And of course, George Floyd and all the other recent incidents that we've been talking about. But I've explained to some people that I work with and others that for me, it boils down to the fact that if those people were white or any other color except for Black, I believe the outcome would be different. And even for people who may not have the same viewpoint that I do on some of these issues, with most people, I think they would agree with that point. Mm-hmm. And so, if you can just get people to start there by admitting the fact that if these people were not Black, I believe the outcome would be different, then I feel like that's kind of a jumping off point for conversations to really talk about why that is and start getting to the root of some of those things. And something else that stuck out to me in this chapter is on page 94. It starts on 93 and goes on to 94, where she talks about terms like Black on Black crime is racist. And I've never thought about it like that necessarily. And that's been kind of a point of, I guess, anxiety for me with the whole Black Lives Matter thing, because that's usually people's argument that, well, if you're upset about this, why aren't you marching? When a Black person, kills another Black person. And that bothers me a lot, as well. And so, I struggled with that for a little while. Like, can I really be upset about this if I'm not having the same energy every time, someone is murdered in our city? But I do like the way that she explains it. And the way that I think about it too, in addition to the way it's described in this book, is, the police are paid from our tax dollars to protect and to serve. And, a lot of people try to bring up the idea that, well, let's look into George Floyd's background, his criminal history. He was not a perfect person. And so, and like in that in some way justifies what happened to him. And like someone said on Twitter, you have to remind people, it's not the job of police to kill guilty people. So even if he was guilty of whatever crime he was called, the police called for, that their job is to detain and to de-escalate the situation. And so just keeping that in mind.
Yes, when you get into discussions on Facebook, which I really don't recommend, with people who truly disagree, that's the first thing they'll say. Well, they're criminals. They had a felony. Well, you know what? Even if they had a felony, that doesn't mean that the police had the right to kill them. They're not the judge or the jury. So they didn't have the right to kill them just because they had a felony. That's not a good argument. So I feel like I spend too much of my time on social media saying that. But no, you don't get to kill them because they may have done something wrong in their past.
I agree with both of you so much on that. And I feel compelled every time someone, a friend or on like those pages, the Speak Out pages in Richmond, every time someone writes, well, if you weren't committing crime or if you weren't a thug or, something awful like that, I am compelled every time to comment, Breonna Taylor was sleeping. And we can go on, all of those folks who were killed for, no reason at all. But the simple fact that Breonna Taylor was innocent and sleeping in her bed, it just makes me so angry. And I just feel compelled to remind people that in addition to everything that you all have said, it shouldn't impact, it doesn't make it okay. It doesn't make it okay.
I think one of the reasons why this talking is important is because white folks in particular have a duty to stop being complicit in this supremacist system. And we, maybe 10 years ago, I doubt it, but maybe I could say, oh, I didn't know what was happening. But we know what's happening. Videos, there's stories, endless stories. People have written wonderful books Michelle Alexander, Ava DuVernay just put out the 13th. There's no reason that we can't start to articulate to our white brothers and sisters what the problem is and how this is all connected. And it's one of the things I loved about Oluo's book is that pushing us to articulate how this is connected to the system, not about necessarily just one incident, but a system of violence and oppression. And so we have to practice in safe mixed cases like these, working through what's problematic and how we confront that, whether it is in Facebook or in our smaller circles or in Ivy Tech. We are a large community of mixed people who have an obligation. There's, maybe, I don't know how many people signed up for this talk, but what percentage of the population is that, right? So, we've got to take it to our faculty members who are the same as those Facebook people that are, maybe they're not saying it out loud, but that's the work we need to do, and we need to practice how to do it.
Kara, you began the conversation about this chapter by, that excerpt about the full support of the system. And I hadn't really thought of it in those terms. I always think of it as from my now decades of personal experience.
Right.
Earlier in that chapter, the author talks about learning to drive when she was 16 years old. And she makes the statement, and of course I'm off of an ebook, so my page numbers mean nothing. She says, when we first learn to drive, it's with the same excitement of anybody else newly behind the wheel, a bit of fear mixed with a sense of freedom and power. And this is the sentence that got me. But while our white friends quickly settle into the mundanity of the daily commute, we never get that sense of ease. And then later on, several paragraphs after, she says, I know that it's hard to believe that the people you look to for safety and security are the same people who are causing us so much harm. But I'm not lying and I'm not delusional. I am scared and I am hurting and we are dying. And I really, really need you to believe me. And, that really resonated with me as recently as not just my own experiences living here in Fishers, but even on our own Ivy Tech campuses where I've been stopped, where I've been asked as recently as, very recently, where I was asked what I was doing in the building, even when I had my name tag on, as far as who I was, and still being asked why I was in an Ivy Tech building. So, and realizing that the best way to handle those situations is to try to be respectful. It's frustrating, and it's a very, very stressful way to have to live. So I appreciate that we're having this discussion about this chapter.
I want to go back for just a second to Lauren's comment where you were talking about concern over all deaths, whether they're caused by the police or whether they're caused by community crime. And I know that the author did a good job of noting that higher levels of community crime are also due to systemic factors, systemic racism and other systemic factors. But to me, the defining difference here is that this crime, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, these are carried out by agents of the state. I mean, they have the power and the authority of the state behind them. I read something this week that in New York City, the police union, I guess it is prohibiting turning over body cam film to the citizens' organizations who are charged with reviewing it. So they simply won't release the films. What good is it to tell somebody they have to wear a body cam if you're not going to hold them accountable for what appears on there? So it's the role of the complicity of the state in upholding the authority of the police in acting this way.
You're so right, Sarah, because, as again, someone online said, if a Black person kills another Black person and the police know about it, the murderer is prosecuted and goes to jail and is usually convicted. And so that's the difference. That's why it's not the same thing. And sadly, the outrage is not the same.
I can't help but think of going back to the interconnectivity and how everything's related, that we're talking about policing, but we're also talking about the media, because that's how we find out about all of this. So we really can't isolate this, I don't think, to just talking about policing if we're not talking about the words and the way that it's communicated and how we find out about it, even though it's been going on for a while. I just think back to like has already been mentioned, the conversations on social media and how we are gathering this information. And even when I think about the way the murders are portrayed and even the, Black on Black crimes, like when I hear, to Lauren's point, when I hear about, oh, there was a shooting last night and I live near Cincinnati. And so automatically I assume it's not a white person. And that's like right there. Those are the kind of implicit biases that we have to start to question. And so I think going back to the systemic issue, it's also systemic. It's not just one thing, but it builds on all these other things.
I have a question. And this is directed toward our European American allies. What type of, and I don't know if anyone on this call can answer this, but what type of implicit biases do you think would drive a mostly European American jury to view footage where an African American is being beaten or somehow abused? And, let's just say they're saying they say, well, they're resisting arrest after, while they're being beat with a baton or something, and they move to try to protect themselves. What kind of biases are there towards interactions between African Americans and the police that drive European Americans to validate the behavior of police officers? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, it absolutely does.
It does.
I served on a jury a few years ago, and I think something that someone else mentioned on this, I heard several jurors when they were at the jury selection stage say if they were arrested or if the police got involved, they were obviously guilty and had done something wrong to have the police called on them in the first place. So I literally heard people say that while they were being selected for a jury. Obviously, those jurors were thrown out, but...
Right. Well, and I think, Stephanie, our justice system is supposed to be based on a trial by a jury of your peers. And I served on a jury for an African-American defendant, and there was one Black and one Latino person on the jury. So 2 people of color out of 12. And that is, I think the foundation starts with underrepresentation of underrepresented populations in our juries for whatever and I've just started digging into some of that research to better understand that. But I think that that's a part of it. And jury service, it's an important part of our constitutional and citizen rights in this country. It also sucks. I mean, if you've done it lately, it's not very much fun. And it's inconvenient. I work in a position where I don't have a problem telling my boss I have jury duty. That's not a problem for me. I'm not going to lose my job. But so many Americans are going to lose their job. And so does that keep people off of juries who need to be serving on juries, because they are in a much closer peer status in so many ways to the person sitting in the defendant seat as well? Like that, I think there are thousands of answers to your question, and they're all really important ones we have to begin to think about. And to Diane's point on intersectionality, like, I want to solve all of them, but it's going to take so long.
Well, I'm just thinking, and those are great responses, guys. I appreciate it, because I really have been wondering. But to me, I kind of like to get to like the core issue of things. And to me, and I'm so happy that we're having this conversation, because juries are regular people like everybody on this call. So it's important that we all kind of, understand that racism does exist in policing. Mm-hmm. And then that will, if we understand that, European Americans, Latino Americans, African Americans, if everyone collectively understands that this exists and that we can look at these images, these video cameras, these videos from a non-biased standpoint and understand that racism exists and does that play a part in what we're watching, then we can start getting some convictions, and then perhaps that would stem the misbehavior of police officers who kill African Americans and who beat African Americans. So that's where I'm thinking with the juries. But African Americans are guilty too. Historically we think it's kind of a game to get out of jury duty, and we don't really see that we're hurting ourselves when we don't show up, or we lie and say, oh, I'm sick and I can't show up. We don't understand the seriousness of showing up for jury duty to be sure that justice is served.
Stephanie, if it's implicit, and in some cases not so implicit, it's more overt, but in white communities, unfortunately, I think that there's a social construct that's developed, and it's a model of deviancy that the majority of Black people have some sort of deviancy, that some sort of weakness. It's part of the white folklore, whether it's education, whether it's socioeconomic standing. The white folks have earned it, and we've got a couple bad eggs, but it is, I worked in a residential facility, and it's rough, because I think that there's definitely, again, some of it's not implicit bias, some of it's just overt bias that you're guilty until proven innocent. You're guilty just walking down the street. And it's really, to get to Benjamin's point from a little earlier, silence is violence. That was one of the signs I saw that really got me. I feel really poorly that I feel like a pretty aware person, but I slide right into whiteness. I'm uncomfortable. That's too bad. And then you go about your business, where unfortunately people that don't look like me don't have that opportunity at all. So I don't know if that helps, but.
What I think is so interesting about your question, Stephanie, is that they do, you will hear people say, oh, well, they had this criminal record and background. But then the same people will say nothing of the background, as you mentioned before, was mentioned before about the police officer. And that people aren't good or bad, ever, inherently. No one is good or bad. Everyone possesses goodness and badness. And so why do we take one instance and make that one instance account for everything in a person's life? And again, back to the media. We do this all the time. So somebody was a police officer, let's say 10 years ago. For example, my husband, he was a police officer, and he's not been for a long time. But if something happens, and let's say, for example, he gets a DUI, it's going to be reported in the media, former police officer gets a DUI. So it's all about the way that it's phrased and how we take these, again, like intersectionality, we kind of stop including that, and we take a piece of something of that person's life and we make it apply to everything about them holistically. Mm-hmm. And so I don't have a good answer to your question, because I think it's sad that people do that. And I agree with Todd that I think it's a little bit less implicit in that case.
And I think, for allies, they may step up to the plate and go out on a limb and tell somebody, that's racist, or report something, or try to help in a situation. And then the system's like, oh, we're not really going to deal with that. It's like, well, I'm not going to do that again. I tried to help once and it didn't work out, so I'm not going to do anything else.
I had my first jury duty experience back in right after Thanksgiving. And it was a Black defendant who was charged with assault with serious bodily injury. And one of the things that was discussed was race and the defendant's perceptions of what was happening at the time. And through that experience, one of the things that was, really interesting, if anyone's never at least done jury duty here where I'm at, the judge came in and spoke to us at the end. And one of the things that the other jurors brought up was, we are all white. for this Black defendant. And a lot of us were, in a very different socioeconomic status than he was. For example, I'm here as faculty at Ivy Tech. We had a faculty member on the jury from IU East. So, that was kind of really interesting. And they said, I thought this was supposed to be a jury of his peers. And the judge said, that's a really excellent point, and that would be grounds for an appeal for them. And that she wishes it was something that could be addressed. And at the same time I was being selected for this jury, there was another jury selection going on in the other court. And she said, that jury pool ended up getting dismissed, but there were only 2 Black people who were there for it. And she said, because of the way the system is set up to have impartial, they couldn't even pull them in because of the way we were set up. Mm-hmm. So, that's a really good question of how do we ensure as the justice system that we're getting a jury of their peers.
All right, I'm going to expand our conversation to add in chapter 7. I think we could discuss this chapter all day, which is, I'm glad that we can. I'm glad that we're having this kind of conversation. All right, so chapter 7 is entitled, How Can I Talk About Affirmative Action? And I chose a quote from page 113. Affirmative action is a term thrown around wildly in conversations about race, usually by those who are firmly on the, and I quote, there is no racism, there is only reverse racism / affirmative action is racism against white people, end quote, crowd. When not used as argument, it's used as an insult. Oh yeah, you're an affirmative action hire. But for all the talk, for all those who tear it down and all those who try to defend it, not many people fully understand affirmative action. And I chose this because I've read her chapter. Affirmative action is not a topic that I have dug into, and that's some learning I need to do. So I still don't feel like I really understand how we support this appropriately and how we move forward. So that's why I chose that. So what about this chapter, about that quote, anything else in the chapter spoke to you?
I thought what she said, which I had known prior, the people that have benefited most from affirmative action are white women. Mm-hmm. And I've known that. I've seen the data on it. And I'm glad women have benefited, but I think that's interesting because these people think that all these Black people got ahead and didn't deserve it, when honestly, the percentages show it was mostly white women, and I'm sure they did deserve it. But I just think that's interesting that the narrative is, well, you Black people got all these opportunities you didn't deserve, and that's not true at all.
Right. And Diane, I'm so glad you brought that up, because as a white woman, I should know about this because it has probably helped me. And I just don't.
I think this kind of goes along with, some things that Leanne's been saying about the media. You just hear, people don't really know what affirmative action is or what it does or how it started. And so they just hear that and have a perception of what that means. And I kind of think about that now, like with people only wanting to read a headline of an article. Mm-hmm. They just want the quick soundbite without digging into it and learning more about it. Mm-hmm. And it's just easier to do that. And then you go around with saying things like it's reverse racism or things like that, because that's just the perception that you have based on the tiny bit of information you know.
I was struck by the fact that, well, I agree with Kara. I don't know as much about affirmative action as I should. I know even less about the deficit that's created, that has been created historically for people of color. And, I think that's telling too. And, we're certainly learning about that in the book, but all of the deficit is the only word I can think of to describe it, that, that puts people of color, so far behind everybody else. We really need to talk about that. I don't mean us here now, but as a culture and as a society, I think we need to talk about those things. And I think if we understand those things better, affirmative action might seem more like a good idea, or less like something I think that is as controversial as it's perceived now.
We discuss affirmative action a good bit in some of my political science classes. And the question that arises that I struggle the most to respond to is, well, now that we've had affirmative action going on for however many decades, why aren't things equal? If affirmative action works, then why aren't things equal now? And it's very difficult to address the notion of like cumulative history, the impact of cumulative history doesn't turn around quickly. That this is a step to address, to redress some of the deficits, as Stephanie says, some of the gaps that have been created. But in the book, the author notes that, it's not enough simply to keep using affirmative action if we don't address the systemic problems that still exist that are not going to allow equality in education and in employment and other opportunities, that will be kind of perpetually in a situation where we have to keep doing this if we don't get rid of the systemic problems that underlie it.
I think about this on two levels. One is about the white folks, the conversations, the education, the ignorance that we're allowed to walk around with. And how do we respond? And I think of a situation that happened over dinner maybe last year, where I used to work in Louisville at the community college in downtown Louisville. And I was having dinner with some colleagues, a couple of white women, and they were talking about the new hires. And there was a black woman who was hired, and she beat out some of some people who had previously been let go. And there were, I'm sure, I felt it at the time, and I know more now, kind of aspersions about why this woman was chosen. And I was a coward. I didn't say anything about it, thought about it, but we have to be armed and be ready to talk about it and be ready to say, it's not right what you're suggesting. There was a process and this person was chosen, and we need more diversity in our college. It's a huge problem from my perspective in my department. Every department I've ever been in as a math person, 90% white. And so that's the second level, right? I mean, just on a personal level, I need to know how to talk about this. And on an institutional level, we have absolutely an opportunity to do something every time we hire. And we don't need a policy from the government to tell us how to do it. We just need to be intentional and think about the ways in which our hiring practices are reinforcing this monochrome institution.
Ben, if I could ask, do you think that reading this book so far in this chapter has made you more comfortable having that conversation?
Well, what makes it, no, I mean, you don't get more comfortable. You just have to do it. You have to commit, and you have to stop being a coward, and you have to say, I am not going to be complicit anymore. And part of my commitment to that is, these are very nice women. I'm sure they wouldn't have, stormed out of the room on me, but it's just so easy to be silent, as Todd said.
I think it is really challenging in situations where people do try to take things forward and nothing is done about it. And it's such a tough situation, because I was thinking about, like when she was talking about when she left the company and she did the exit interview. People say a lot of things in exit interviews and then nothing ever changes. And it's hard when it's even coming from the person's mouth, like nobody else is even speaking on behalf of that person, but then nothing ever changes. It can just, and if I feel that disheartened and I'm not even the person that's experiencing it personally, I can't even imagine what that feels like for the person that is experiencing it.
I think it's important for those who are hiring to not so much, and this is going to sound weird, but not so much focus on ethnicities of people, but focus on the idea of diversity to create innovative ideas. Like, it's research based that when you have diverse people at the table, that you get, new schools of thought and ingenuity and creativity blossoms, and it's better for the company or for the organization. So I think if we could probably focus on that instead of, we need an African-American hire, or we need a Latino-American hire, even though that may be true. I just think that maybe hiring committees should just focus on, we need diversity, and how do we go about doing that?
And I think we also need to look at, what we're prioritizing or what we're holding as a good candidate, because I think that when we look at things like, you know, this person went to this college, or they had all of these different internships, or, you know, whatever it is, these tend to be systems that, you know, are more readily available to white people or the majority. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done around our selection processes, both for admissions, but also for hiring.
I was just going to say that kind of relates back to Sarah's point earlier. From a very early start, like her brother, we have to create opportunities from very early on, so that way folks have the ability to succeed in life and to pursue a degree. And, you know, similar to the story about her mother, who had all of these responsibilities she was juggling. And I think it took her 12 years for her degree, but she was able to finish it. You know, compare that to someone who, you know, may have had a totally different set of circumstances, come from a more privileged background, and would have been able to complete that at 4 years. We have to be able to recognize a variety of values and experiences.
And Rachel is a associate degree granting institution that also happens to be serving the largest population of students of color in the state. How many positions do we have that truly could require nothing more than an associate degree, or maybe even less than an associate degree? Do we actually let it go forward as a position that requires an associate degree or a high school diploma only? Because we, as educators, we perpetuate that system of additional education required. And it's traditional, but is it just, and is it right? And I'm grappling with that one right now too. Great question.
To kind of jump back to the point Stephanie was making about thinking about diversity for innovation, I agree with that. But I do think there are times that you do have to call out race specifically for certain things, or other demographic things, especially if you're in a position or in an institution like Ivy Tech where you want to have representation. So if you're, you got to look at the people that you're serving and make sure that at least you're, along the lines of the demographics of the area. And like, I used to have this type of conversation with nonprofits a lot that were looking at the diversity of their boards. Mm-hmm. And, the argument was always made, well, that there's, a giving requirement, or there's, certain connections or something that people have to have. And we just can't find diverse candidates, to put on our board. But my question would always be, but what are you doing? If you're only looking within your networks and asking people that to serve on your board, then it's probably going to be hard to find, people outside of that. But if you're only kind of thinking that only one group of people, has access to resources, or, have the type of jobs or whatever, how are you advertising? How are you getting the word out about, your services or serving on your board? So there are times that I do think that you do have to call it out and say that this is important, and make a concerted effort. And not saying that you're always going to be successful in trying to have representation, but at least you can document that this is what we try to do, to reach out to these groups, because we know that it's important to have these voices in the room.
So what I was thinking when I made that comment, I would like to see us focus on the idea of diversity, kind of like as a guiding principle or as a vision, instead of saying, affirmative action, we got to have XYZ, African Americans, XYZ. And that may be the case, but I'm just thinking, instead of focusing on the end result, I guess, maybe I'm trying to say, focus on the vision, which is to create innovative ideas and creativity. And then that be the process for getting to diversity, to the innovative ideas. Having, making sure you have so many African Americans, making sure you have this as a process, but not as we just want to have this many people, to have this many people, but that being the process to getting to diversity, to being a more powerful organization. Does that make sense?
Definitely.
Okay.
Absolutely. It starts a question in my mind too of what people's definition of diversity is.
Mm-hmm.
I teach the general studies and liberal arts capstone course. And part of their portfolio that they have to do is they have to submit a paper about diversity awareness. And this is one of the biggest questions I get in my class. They say, well, I've never written a paper about race before. And I'm like, diversity isn't just about race.
Right.
And so I start talking to them about all the things diversity includes. And they're like, oh, like, I don't even know that sometimes people really are wrapping their mind around what diversity is inclusive of.
Yeah. All right, let's expand our conversation to chapter 8 because I haven't done a good job of managing time. I'm enjoying the conversation a lot this afternoon. So chapter 8 is what is the school to prison pipeline? And I started this chapter on page 124. Our public school system sees Black and brown children as violent, disruptive, unpredictable future criminals. That sentence just, it hurts me. I know there's a ton of truth in it, and it hurts a lot.
Has anyone seen the news story that's been out the past couple of days about the 15-year-old named Grace, I think in Michigan? I've read a lot about it, and it really talks about in some of the articles looking at it that it's really reinforcing the school to prison pipeline.
Sarah, if you have a couple of links, will you send those to me and I'll make sure they get in the show notes?
Is that the little girl that's in prison because she wasn't doing her homework?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes, she was, if I remember correctly, she was on probation, and she had reported that she had fallen back asleep and missed one day of her e-learning. So the judge remanded her into custody at the juvenile detention center.
There's a really good podcast series right now called Caught. I don't remember if I referenced it with this group last time, but it talks in depth about the school to prison pipeline, and it features Washington State, which has just a crazy truancy to policing connection that I would have never even thought of. I never thought about missing school. I loved school. I made it my job. It's one of those things that I struggle to understand.
If I can jump in here, this chapter resonated a little bit as a former K-12 educator, program chair of education, training teachers, right? This one resonates. But I do think, one, I'm a male teacher in predominantly a female space. And as I look at my teachers in training, right, the majority of the teaching workforce is white and female. And as a father of 3 boys that are really active, as a former little boy myself, right, we're really active. And then you throw in another mix of Black boys, and you think about boys and just their ability to be active and engaging. And if, my daughter is very, very different than my 3 boys, and their behaviors are different. The things they're interested in is different. And I go back to, even when we talked about intersectionality earlier, there's a very difference between being a little boy and a little girl in a classroom and what's going to interest you and how you're going to express yourself and those kind of things. And if you are a white woman who hasn't thought about the upbringing and development of a little boy, and if you're talking about a white woman teaching a Black boy, that's even a further disconnect. And it's a shame because I know she mentioned some statistics, and there's so many statistics about, how many children of color who do, poorly on standardized testing. We know how many children of color who are more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD and all of these other, special education labels that make them sound like they're not normal and they're not able to perform as good as their white peers and those kind of things. And you can't help but think the lack of cultural competency that happens within our education training and our educators, and of course the systematic issues that we've been talking about in this discussion overall. And there's a big need, and that weighs heavy on me as an educator for educators, and it's something that we in our own program work really hard to think through and try to help in some small way. But that's something that stood out to me in this particular chapter, and it's heavy.
I'd like to share from a disability support point of view, amplifying what people are saying. You're reading the psych evals and the IEPs, and these labels of disability are being put on folks in the third grade. And the other thing that comes up is, again, this bias of deviancy. It's not all I got to say about it. I mean, it's just there. Again, how do we get to action to correct it? But there's, if you have that label put on you in the third grade, and on top of that your behavior is a behavior problem versus any number of other things like you're not being fed or whatever. That's just, it pains me to be with an 18-year-old person that's got that baggage, and we somebody put it on them.
Todd, I think that sends a message on what kind of value that they feel for themselves too.
Well, it also highlights how we're trying to use the justice system for things that it was never designed to do. The justice system and the mental health system shouldn't intersect as often as they do. And yet we use a justice system, and I think it's wrong to say that. We use prison as a placeholder for mental health treatment far too often because we haven't invested in mental health treatment and haven't destigmatized mental health treatment and mental health just awareness.
I was going to say that, when I first found out about the school to prison pipeline, I wasn't as surprised by it as I should have been. But just thinking back to my experiences, I love school. I didn't love math, but I loved the rest of school. And I can just remember how, dealing with teachers and how they interacted with me, because I pretty much had the same voice and the same tone that I have now. So immediately, anything I said, people thought I was challenging them. And I wasn't. I was just talking. And I can just remember, how my teachers, my white female teachers, reacted to that. I had white male teachers as well, but especially with the white female teachers, there was an issue sometimes because they took the way I spoke and, as like I was being authoritative when I really wasn't. So I think about now with, young Black boys who are just being active and being kids, how that could be misinterpreted now. If it was misinterpreted years ago, like, in the 80s, like it's probably worse now. And it's like shocking to me. I'm thinking, how do they even stand a chance if this is what they're encountering? Some of them are encountering daily.
Well, you bring up, there's a cultural expectation in the K-12 classroom, right? To sit still, be quiet, listen, a sage on a stage kind of mentality. But that's not how the 21st century learner is. And that's not how boys tend to learn anyway, and maybe girls too. And as a result, we go with a traditional view that is very Eurocentric. And when we start bringing in other people with different cultural backgrounds and learning styles and things like that, we try to force them into this particular mold that they don't fit into. And what's the best thing to do? We could either adapt and try to figure out how they learn, or we can try to place a label on them, maybe use some sort of alternative method, like a medication or something like that, for them to carry for the rest of their life, and try to get them back into the mold again. And we can see through statistics and mislabeling that that's not a method that's working. And so it's unfortunate.
And I think things like the story she told at the beginning of this chapter just feed into those stereotypes and keep them going. Like in the word choices people use, like her son assaulted 2 staff members and the mother was not apparently interested in discussing the matter with him at the moment. And so, I mean, just reading it like that, you're like, you definitely have a vision of what happened, but then upon hearing more information about it, it wasn't that at all.
Right.
Again, it's that quick soundbite, that confirmation bias of what you already believe to be true.
My first encounter with the school to prison pipeline was actually when I was in a classroom. I taught high school math in Florida for a couple of years. And I had a class, I think it was my second year, teaching of the Florida standardized test, the FCAT. If you failed the FCAT, you went into this special class to help remediate you to get that. So I had a section of that. And just chatting with the kids one day, they started talking about their experiences with jail and with the courts. And every single one of them, by the age of 17, had some interaction with the courts and with police. and and it was a very diverse class. It was a very urban, diverse school. And I just thought I missed something growing up. Like it didn't resonate with me. And then I realized the things they had to go through as a result of that, and how that already at 15, 16, 17, how that already labeled them for the rest of their lives. And it saddened me because they're all great kids. I loved them, and most of them passed their FCAT the next time. So I'm really happy about that too.
Here, that's the last paragraph of that chapter. But when I look at our school to prison pipeline, the biggest tragedy to me is the loss of childhood joy.
Yep. And I loved those kids. I mean, they were my favorites. I had honors algebra. I had a trig class. I had all these advanced kids, but I loved those kids because they worked so hard once you figured out how to motivate them. All right, friends. Well, it is very close to 5:00, so I'll give you a couple minutes back in your day. Thank you again for being brave and for coming and being uncomfortable in this space, and for being honest and vulnerable with each other. It's been a great conversation today, and you have made my day and my week better. So thank you all so much. We're going to take a little break for a couple of weeks as we all finish up the semester and get a little time off. But we'll be back in the fall semester after classes get started to continue our conversation. So have a great break. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks again for listening. I'm your host, Kara Monroe. You can connect with me on Twitter at KNM Tweets. You can reach us by email at ourcollegeorvoices@ivytech.edu. Leave us a voicemail at 317-572-5049. Don't forget, if you're an Ivy Tech faculty or staff member, you can always join our Microsoft Teams listener community. Our website is ivytech.edu/podcast. Production assistance for this and every episode provided by Becky Campbell, Sarah Ferguson, and the Ivy Tech Community College marketing team. Our podcast concept is by Matthew Pittman. Theme music and post-production services are provided by Jen Eads at the Brassy Broadcasting Company. We'll talk to you next time on Our College, Your Voices.